June 22, 1941. The sun rose over the Eastern Front, glinting off hundreds of German panzer tanks lined up like metallic predators, poised to swallow entire villages in their path. To the men facing them, the sight was almost surreal. Gleaming steel beasts, turreted and relentless, rumbling forward in perfect synchronization. The blitzkrieg machine was supposed to be unstoppable, and for a moment it seemed that nothing in the world could halt it. Yet by nightfall, many of these invincible monsters lay smoldering, twisted, almost laughably vulnerable against weapons that, at first glance, seemed laughably inadequate. A stick of TNT, a crude rifle, a bottle of gasoline. Against the panzer's armor, these items were, on paper, absurd. But reality has a way of humbling theory. In the early days of the war, German armored divisions struck fear across Europe. Their panzers were the embodiment of modern warfare, fast, heavily armored, and seemingly indestructible. Infantrymen, armed only with rifles and the occasional anti-tank rifle, were expected to stop them. Imagine being handed a slingshot and told to take down a lion. That was the reality for many Soviet and Allied soldiers. Desperation forced ingenuity. The boy's anti-tank rifle, a British invention, seemed comically unwieldy. A 30-pound firearm designed to punch through early panzer armor. It was noisy, it recoiled like a mule, and hitting a moving tank often felt like trying to swat a fly with a broomstick. Yet, when it connected, sometimes in a weak spot on the side or rear of the tank, the effect was terrifyingly real. Armor plating that inspired awe in planning rooms across Europe could buckle under a single well-placed shot. And then there were the Molotov cocktails. Simple glass bottles filled with gasoline, ignited with a rag, and hurled at enemy tanks. The idea seemed almost medieval, a primitive answer to cutting-edge engineering. Yet in urban and forested battles, these humble bottles became symbols of resistance. Soviet soldiers called them flaming gifts for the invaders. When they shattered on engine grates or air vents, the tanks choked, smoked, and sometimes caught fire entirely. Numbers tell story, too. By the end of 1941, German losses on the Eastern Front surprised even the most optimistic Allied planners. While panzers were supposed to roll unhindered, records indicate that hundreds of tanks were disabled or destroyed in their first months of Operation Barbarossa, many by small-scale, improvised weapons rather than artillery barrages. The contrast was striking. Mass steel, designed to crush opposition, felled by ingenuity, fear, and a dash of luck. Soldiers' accounts bring these events to life. One Soviet infantryman wrote, "We were told to hold the line, even with sticks if we had to. But a stick became a spear when it pierced the engine compartment, and a bottle became a lance. Fear made us clever." Such testimonies capture more than technical effectiveness. They reveal the psychological punch. The sight of a massive panzer immobilized by a single Molotov or a satchel charge brought not just tactical advantage, but hope, a small, human triumph against mechanized terror. Even historians note the irony. John Erickson, in The Road to Stalingrad, remarks that the early anti-tank efforts made the mighty appear almost fragile, a reminder that war is often less about perfect machines and more about imperfect humans finding ways to survive. And indeed, there is a certain dark humor in imagining armored giants, designed to crush everything in their path, brought low by what seems like a child's plaything in comparison. The day the steel met its match was not marked by grandiose artillery or dramatic tank battles in the traditional sense. It was a day of small weapons, unexpected victories, and the slow dawning realization that German tanks, for all their fearsome reputation, were not invulnerable. Each destroyed tank whispered a lesson to the infantry. Adaptability, courage, and creativity could even the playing field. By nightfall, the survivors were exhausted, muddy, and shaken, but emboldened. The myth of invincible armor had cracked, if not entirely shattered. And somewhere in the smoke, soldiers understood that the weapons of yesterday, rudimentary, human scale, and surprisingly effective, would be the foundation for the next stage of anti-tank innovation. But what came next would shock them even more, as humanity's inventiveness met steel in ways no one had yet imagined. By 1943, the battlefield had changed. German panzers were no longer the untouchable kings of the front. A lone British soldier, crouched in mud and rain, lined up his PIT launcher, a curious, spring-loaded contraption that looked more like a medieval siege engine than modern weaponry, at the belly of a Tiger tank. With a single thunderous shot, the giant shuddered, smoke curling from its seams, and rolled no more. It was an almost absurd sight. A machine engineered to crush fortifications, cross rivers, and terrify armies could be felled by a man carrying a handheld launcher and wearing a soaked wool uniform. Yet absurdity was a hallmark of war. As the Allies learned ingenuity, human, improvisational, and relentlessly adaptive, could outmatch steel. Advanced anti-tank weapons became the great equalizers. The American bazooka, a rocket-propelled missile launcher, allowed infantry to strike from cover. The German Panzerfaust, ironically, was a handheld weapon designed to stop tanks like the very panzers the Germans fielded. Soviet engineers introduced self-propelled artillery and shaped charges that could pierce even the thick armor of a Tiger or Panther. Suddenly, the battlefield was not just a contest of metal, but of brains, courage, and timing. These weapons were not just tools, they were statements. At Kursk, in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, tens of thousands of armored vehicles clashed. But alongside the massive panzers, the Allies deployed small, portable anti-tank weapons. Tanks that seemed impervious were disabled, overturned, or abandoned. Reports indicate that over 800 German tanks were lost in a single sector, many to infantry equipped with what would have seemed, in 1941, laughably inadequate weapons. Personal testimonies capture the human drama. A British infantryman recalled, "I lined up the rocket under that Tiger's belly, and for a moment I thought it wouldn't work. But then the armor buckled. I could almost hear the thing groan. Never have I felt such disbelief and triumph at the same time." Across Italy, the Normandy hedgerows, and the forests of the Ardennes, similar stories unfolded. Ordinary soldiers wielding extraordinary ingenuity. The numbers alone tell part of the story, but the imagery completes it. Smoke choked the air as panzer turrets twisted and snapped. Sparks flew when rockets met steel. Mud, blood, and rain blurred the edges of combat, yet through it all, the human scale of resistance, one soldier, one launcher, one well-aimed shot, made the difference. Engineers' calculations, test reports, and battlefield records all confirmed it. Even the most formidable armor had a weakness, often right under its nose. And yet, There was a certain irony. The Tiger, capable of obliterating bunkers, had to contend with weapons small enough to be carried in a backpack. Historian Stephen Zaloga observes, the very ingenuity of the infantry often made tanks seem almost theatrical in their downfall. A monster felled by a man with a stick and a spark. History rarely feels so dramatically ironic. In urban combat, the effect was even more pronounced. Streets lined with rubble became death traps for panzers. Molotov cocktails, mines, and handheld launchers turned the environment itself into a weapon. German crews often abandoned their vehicles rather than risk being burned alive inside their own steel tombs. One German officer wrote, "We expected fear from the enemy, not from the ground itself, nor from men armed with little more than courage and explosive packs." The emotional transformation on both sides was stark. For Allied troops, each disabled tank reinforced hope and ingenuity. Each Tiger brought down was a testament to human resilience. For German crews, the realization that no armor was invulnerable shook confidence, morale, and strategy. The myth of invincibility had crumbled, leaving fear and uncertainty in its wake. Even humor found its way through the grimness. Soldiers joked that the Tiger, feared across Europe, was finally allergic to small explosions. But beneath the laughter was respect for technology, yes, but more for the human ingenuity that bent steel and defied odds. By the end of 1944, the lessons were clear. The war was no longer just a contest of machines. It was a contest of adaptability, creativity, and courage. Tanks, no matter how formidable, could be neutralized by minds willing to see the gaps, to exploit weaknesses, to improvise. The myth of the invincible panzer was dead. In its place stood a more human truth, ingenuity, determination, and a willingness to fight against all odds were the real weapons that shattered Hitler's armored divisions. And yet, even as these weapons evolved, the Germans were dreaming up counters, already developing thicker armor and clever tactics. But for a moment, in those muddy fields and ruined villages, humanity proved it could bend steel, shape destiny, and transform fear into triumph.